The candles in the chapel had already burned halfway down when Eleanor Whitfield understood, with total certainty, that the man she was about to marry did not want her. She stood at the altar in a gown stitched with pearls her mother could not afford, and she watched Duke Edmund Ashcombe look past her, toward the chapel doors, as if he were waiting for someone else to walk through them instead. The priest spoke the opening words of the ceremony. Edmund did not hear a single one. His eyes stayed fixed on the doors until his aunt, seated in the front pew, cleared her throat sharply enough to pull him back into the room. Eleanor noticed. She noticed everything that day, because noticing was the only power she had left. Her father had arranged this marriage to settle a debt that would have otherwise ruined their family name. She had agreed to it the way a person agrees to jump from a burning building, not because the fall is safe, but because the alternative is worse. She had told herself, in the weeks leading up to the wedding, that affection could grow later. She had told herself many comforting things. Standing at the altar, watching Edmund's jaw tighten every time the doors creaked in the wind, she stopped telling herself anything at all. The vows were said. Rings were exchanged. Edmund's hand was cold when it slid the band onto her finger, and he did not look at her when he did it. The guests clapped. Somewhere near the back of the chapel, a young widow named Camille Hargrove dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and 3 older women near her exchanged glances that Eleanor was not meant to see, but did. She learned her husband's secret before the wedding breakfast had even ended. A cousin of Edmund's, a talkative young man named Peter, who had clearly enjoyed the wine more than was wise, leaned toward Eleanor during the meal and said, with the careless honesty of someone who assumed she already knew, that it was such a shame Edmund could not marry Camille instead, given how devoted they had been to each other before his father forced this arrangement. Eleanor set down her fork very slowly. She asked Peter to repeat himself, and he did, growing paler as he realized what he had done. She thanked him for his honesty and excused herself from the table. She found Edmund alone in the library an hour later, staring into a fire that had not been lit yet, his hand resting on the cold mantel, as though warming itself against something only he could feel. "You love her," Eleanor said. It was not a question. Edmund did not turn around. "I did not choose this marriage, Eleanor. Neither did you. I think we both understand what kind of arrangement this is. I understand that you let me stand at that altar without a word of warning. Would a warning have changed anything? Your father needed this match as much as mine did. We are not the first couple to marry, for reasons that have nothing to do with love, and we will not be the last." Eleanor felt something inside her chest go very still, the way a lake goes still right before ice begins to form on its surface. "Then let us be honest with each other, at least. I will not compete with a woman for a place I already legally hold. I will be your wife in name, and I will run this household well, because that is the role I was given. But do not expect me to beg for affection you have already given away." For the first time that day, Edmund actually looked at her. Something crossed his face, surprise perhaps, or the faint discomfort of a man realizing his new wife was not going to be as easy to dismiss as he had assumed. That is a strange kind of wedding vow. "It is the only honest one either of us has spoken today," Eleanor answered, and she left him standing by the unlit fire. That night, in the enormous bedroom that was now supposedly hers, Eleanor sat by the window and looked out over the dark grounds of Ashcombe Hall, the estate that would be her home for the rest of her life. She thought of her mother's voice, gentle and practical, telling her before she left home that marriage was often less about love and more about survival, and that a clever woman could build a good life inside even a cold arrangement, if she was patient and sharp enough to see where real power actually lived. Eleanor decided, sitting there in her wedding dress with her hair coming loose from its pins, that she would be exactly that kind of woman. She would not cry over a man who had never truly been hers to lose. She would learn this house, this land, these people, and she would make herself so essential to its running that no one, not even a duke chasing a lost love, could ever make her feel small in it again. The days that followed confirmed everything Peter's careless words had revealed. Edmund was polite to Eleanor at breakfast and distant by afternoon. He rode out from the estate 3 or 4 times a week, always toward the village, where Camille Hargrove lived, in a modest cottage, left to her by her late husband, a naval officer who had died at sea 2 years earlier. The servants did not speak of it directly in front of Eleanor, but she was not a foolish woman, and she could read the pattern of silence as clearly as words. Instead of confronting him again, Eleanor turned her attention to the house itself. She began rising early, before the rest of the household stirred, and walking the grounds with the estate's aging housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Colton, who had served the Ashcombe family for over 20 years, and had seen 3 duchesses come and go, without ever once being asked her opinion on anything that mattered. Eleanor asked her opinion on everything. She asked about the tenant farms, the state of the roofs on the cottages, the wages paid to the staff, the accounts that had apparently not been properly reviewed since Edmund's father passed away 3 years earlier. Mrs. Colton, startled at first by a duchess who wanted to understand the ledgers rather than simply approve them with a signature, warmed to Eleanor within a matter of weeks. She began bringing her small problems that had been quietly ignored for years: a leaking roof in the northern tenant row, a steward who had been skimming coins off the top of the harvest payments, a stable boy who had not been paid properly in months because no one had bothered to check the records. Eleanor fixed what she could. She dismissed the dishonest steward and replaced him with a careful young man named Gerald Fenwick, who had grown up on the estate and knew every field and fence line better than anyone else who might have applied for the position. She corrected the wages. She visited the tenant families herself, something no duchess at Ashcombe had done in living memory, and she listened to their complaints with a patience that quickly earned their trust. Word of her efforts reached Edmund, but he said little about it. He noticed the improved harvest reports. He noticed that the tenants spoke of the new duchess with something close to warmth. He said nothing, because saying something would have meant acknowledging that his wife, the woman he had married out of obligation and barely looked at, was quietly becoming the most capable person in his household. Eleanor did not do any of this for his approval. She told herself that plainly, every night, as she reviewed the day's small victories in her private study, a room she had claimed for herself in a forgotten corner of the East Wing that no one else wanted. She was not building a good life to win her husband back. She was building it because it was hers to build, and because a woman who made herself useful and clever could never be entirely powerless, no matter how cold the man beside her chose to be. Still, there were nights when the coldness reached further than she wanted to admit. She would hear Edmund's horse return late in the evening, the sound of his boots in the hallway outside her door, pausing sometimes, as though he considered knocking, and then continuing on toward his own rooms without a word. On those nights, Eleanor allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of grief, sitting alone by her window with the candle burned low, before she reminded herself of her promise. 10 minutes, and then she would stand, straighten her shoulders, and return to whatever work waited on her desk. It was during one of these quiet evenings, going through the estate's older financial records at Mrs. Colton's suggestion, that Eleanor first noticed something troubling. A series of payments, made in cash rather than through the estate's usual accounts, going out steadily every month to a name she did not recognize at first glance. She traced the entries back further and further until the pattern became impossible to ignore. The payments had begun almost exactly when Edmund's father died, and they had grown larger with each passing season. She did not yet know where the money was going, though a cold suspicion was already forming in the back of her mind. She closed the ledger carefully, locked it in her desk, and decided to say nothing until she understood the full truth of what her husband was spending, and on whom. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping Ashcombe Hall in frost and long, quiet evenings. Eleanor used the season to deepen her hold on the estate's daily life, learning names she had once only guessed at, memorizing which tenant families needed extra grain, and which ones needed nothing but a kind word and a bit of patience. She hosted a small gathering for the local families before the worst of the cold set in, distributing food and warm cloth with her own hands, an act that Mrs. Colton later told her had not been done properly since Edmund's grandmother had run the house decades earlier. Edmund attended the gathering briefly, standing at the edge of the hall with a cup of warm wine he barely touched, watching his wife move easily among people who clearly adored her. For a moment, something like admiration passed across his face. Eleanor caught it from across the room and held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, refusing to look away first. He was the one who turned aside. That small victory carried her through the rest of the winter. She did not need his admiration. She had simply decided she was no longer afraid to see it, and to know that it meant nothing. Not anymore. Not to a woman who was busy building something real out of a marriage that had begun with nothing but cold hands and empty vows. By the time the snow began to melt and the first green returned to the fields of Ashcombe, Eleanor Whitfield had stopped thinking of herself as a wife, waiting for her husband's love. She had become, in the eyes of every tenant, every servant, and every visiting neighbor, the true mistress of the estate, a woman whose quiet competence was rapidly becoming impossible to ignore, even by the one man who had once assumed she would fade quietly into the background of his life. She did not know yet how far that quiet strength would carry her, or how many storms still waited ahead. But she knew, standing at her study window one early spring morning, with the ledgers spread out before her, and the sound of the estate slowly waking up around her, that she was no longer the frightened bride who had stood alone at that altar, watching a man look past her toward a door that never opened. She had become something else entirely, and whatever happened next, she intended to meet it on her own terms. Spring brought visitors to Ashcombe Hall, distant relatives, and old family friends arriving to see the estate now that the roads were clear again. And among them, to Eleanor's quiet dismay, came an invitation Edmund had apparently already accepted without consulting her. His aunt was hosting a large family gathering at her nearby estate, an event that would bring together most of the Ashcombe family along with half the county's notable households. It was, Mrs. Colton warned her gently while helping arrange her travel trunk, exactly the kind of event where old secrets had a way of stepping into the light, whether anyone invited them or not. Eleanor did not yet know how right that warning would prove to be, but she packed her trunk with steady hands and a calm she had spent months learning to wear like armor. Whatever waited at that gathering, she intended to face it the same way she had faced everything else since her wedding day, with her head held high, and her own quiet strength standing firmly behind her. The Ashcombe family gathering was already in full swing by the time Eleanor and Edmund's carriage rolled up the long gravel drive of Lady Beatrice's estate. Lanterns lined the pathways, and music drifted out through open doors, mixing with the low hum of conversation from dozens of guests already gathered on the terrace. Eleanor smoothed the front of her gown, a deep green silk she had chosen carefully that morning, and reminded herself that she had faced harder rooms than this one over the past several months. She was wrong about that, though she would not realize it for another hour. The evening began well enough. Lady Beatrice, Edmund's aunt, greeted Eleanor warmly, taking her arm and introducing her to relatives Eleanor had never met, praising the improvements at Ashcombe that had apparently become the talk of the county. Eleanor accepted the compliments graciously, aware of Edmund drifting somewhere behind her, greeting old friends with the easy charm he rarely showed at home. It was near the middle of the evening, while Eleanor stood near the long dining table discussing the spring planting with a cousin's husband who managed his own farmland, that she felt the room shift. Conversation near the entrance grew quieter, then rippled outward in a wave of hushed whispers. Eleanor turned toward the doorway and saw Edmund standing there, and beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though she belonged there, stood Camille Hargrove. Edmund had brought her, not as a stranger slipping in uninvited, but openly, walking her through the front doors of his aunt's estate, and introducing her, within Eleanor's hearing, as a close and valued friend of the family. For a moment, Eleanor could not move. The dining room, the music, the low buzz of 30 conversations, all of it seemed to fold in on itself, until the only thing she could see clearly was her husband's hand resting near the small of Camille's back, guiding her further into the room, as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. Lady Beatrice's face had gone pale. Several guests near the doorway exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to open pity, all of it directed toward Eleanor, who stood frozen by the dining table, with a glass of wine in her hand that she had entirely forgotten she was holding. She had two choices in that moment, and she understood both of them with perfect clarity. She could flee the room, retreat to a quiet corner, and let the entire county watch her husband's cruelty unfold without her, whispering about the poor young duchess who had been publicly humiliated on her own family's territory. Or she could walk directly into the center of the room and refuse to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. Eleanor set down her wineglass with a steady hand, straightened the fall of her gown, and walked forward. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear, warm and perfectly composed. "How kind of you to join us this evening. I understand you have been a great support to the Ashcombe family in recent years. Camille's confident expression flickered, just slightly, caught off guard by the calm grace of a woman she had clearly expected to find weeping or storming from the room. The Duke has always been generous with his friendship, she managed after a beat too long. Generosity does seem to run in his family, Eleanor replied smoothly, and turned her attention to Lady Beatrice before either Edmund or Camille could respond further. Aunt Beatrice, this gathering is truly lovely. Ashcombe's own spring celebration will have quite a task matching it next month. The conversation moved on, because Eleanor forced it to move on, steering the room back toward safer topics, with a skill she had not known she possessed until that exact moment. She danced once with an elderly cousin who complimented her steady hand on the estate accounts, a compliment that had clearly traveled further than she realized. She laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny, and she did not once let her gaze drift toward the corner of the room, where Edmund and Camille stood close together, speaking in low voices that Eleanor refused to strain to hear. It was not until the carriage ride home, long after midnight, with the countryside dark and silent outside the windows, that Eleanor finally let herself speak. "You brought her into your aunt's home," she said quietly. "You introduced her to your family, in front of me, as though I were the guest, and she were your wife." Edmund did not answer immediately. He stared out the carriage window, his jaw tight, and for a long moment, Eleanor thought he might simply refuse to respond at all, the way he so often did when a conversation grew uncomfortable. "I did not think," he finally said. "You did not think I would be there, or you did not think it mattered." "Both, perhaps, neither. I do not know, Eleanor. Camille has been a friend to me, since long before either of us married. I did not intend to embarrass you." "But you did," Eleanor said, and her voice, though quiet, carried a steel that had not been there on her wedding night. "You embarrassed me, in front of your entire family. And you did it, because some part of you believes that as your wife, I should simply accept whatever place you choose to give me, no matter how small or how public the humiliation." Edmund turned to look at her then, and in the dim light of the carriage lantern, Eleanor saw something she had not expected, a flicker of genuine shame crossing his features before he could smooth it away. "I did not choose this marriage, and I will not pretend to feelings I do not have. I am not asking you to love me, Edmund. I gave up on that hope on our wedding night, and I have made my peace with it. But I will not be humiliated in public for the sake of a woman you refuse to give up. If you wish to keep her company, keep it privately, and keep it far from any room I am expected to enter. That is the very least you owe me for the title I carry, and the household I have built with my own 2 hands, while you were riding out to see her 3 times a week." The carriage rattled on through the dark for a long stretch of silence. When Edmund finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost uncertain, a tone Eleanor had never heard from him before. "You have done remarkable work at Ashcombe. I have seen it, even if I have said little about it." "I did not do it for your approval," Eleanor answered honestly. "I did it because it was mine to do, and because I refused to spend my life as a woman, waiting quietly in a corner for a husband who will never turn around." Edmund said nothing further for the rest of the journey home, and Eleanor did not press him. She had said what needed saying, and for the first time since her wedding day, she felt something shift in the balance between them, small but undeniable, like the first crack of light appearing beneath a closed door. The weeks following the gathering brought a strange, careful quiet to Ashcombe Hall. Edmund's visits to the village grew slightly less frequent, though Eleanor knew better than to mistake this for any real change of heart. She continued her work with the estate's accounts in the evenings, and it was during one such evening, poring over the same troubling ledger she had first noticed months earlier, that she finally uncovered the truth behind the mysterious cash payments. The name attached to the payments, once she cross-referenced it carefully against the parish records Mrs. Colton helped her obtain, belonged to a small property near the village, a modest cottage with its rent and upkeep paid quietly, monthly, directly from the Ashcombe estate accounts. The cottage belonged to Camille Hargrove. Edmund had been funding his lover's home for years, drawing steadily from the very estate funds that were meant to support the tenants, the staff, and the future of Ashcombe itself. Eleanor sat with the ledger open before her for a long time that night, feeling something harden inside her chest that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with the careful, patient work she had poured into saving this estate from exactly this kind of quiet ruin. She did not confront him immediately. Instead, she began building a plan, carefully and privately, the way she had learned to build everything else since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, brick by brick, with patience as her only true weapon. She spoke quietly with Gerald Fenwick, the honest young steward she had hired months earlier, asking him to help her document every irregular payment going back 3 full years. She spoke with Mrs. Colton about tightening the household's daily expenses in ways that would strengthen the estate's overall position without drawing unwanted attention. She was no longer simply the neglected wife of a distracted duke. She was becoming, quietly and deliberately, the one person at Ashcombe Hall who truly understood where its power and its weaknesses both lived, and she intended to use that understanding when the moment finally called for it. That moment, though Eleanor did not yet know it, was closer than she thought, and when it arrived, it would test everything she had built far more severely than any single humiliating evening at a family gathering ever could. The confrontation Eleanor had been quietly preparing for arrived on a rainy afternoon in early summer, when Edmund returned from the village earlier than usual and found her in her study, the household ledgers spread across her desk in careful, organized stacks. He paused in the doorway, rain still dripping from his coat, and something in his expression told Eleanor he already sensed what she had discovered. "You have been going through the accounts," he said. "I have been running this estate for nearly 2 years, Edmund. Going through the accounts is simply part of my work." Eleanor did not look up immediately, finishing the line she was writing before setting down her pen and finally meeting his eyes. "I know about the cottage." The silence that followed stretched long enough that the only sound in the room was the steady patter of rain against the tall windows. Edmund crossed the room slowly and lowered himself into the chair across from her desk, the confident ease he usually carried noticeably absent. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to understand exactly how much of this estate's future you have quietly spent on a woman who is not your wife." Eleanor kept her voice level, though every word cost her more effort than she let show. 3 years of payments, Edmund. Rent, repairs, and more besides. All drawn from funds that should have gone toward the tenant farms, toward wages, toward the very roof, over the heads of people who depend on this family to survive the winter. I never meant for it to reach this point, and yet it has. Eleanor pushed the ledger across the desk toward him, the columns of figures she had spent weeks organizing, laid out in stark, undeniable clarity. "I have spent 2 years rebuilding what your father left in disarray. I have visited every tenant family myself. I know their names, their children, the state of their roofs before the first frost. I have done this work honestly and quietly, while you spent the estate's future on someone else entirely." Edmund stared down at the numbers for a long moment, his jaw working silently, and when he finally looked up, Eleanor saw something in his face she had never expected to see there, something close to genuine remorse, though whether it was remorse for her, or simply for the mess he had made of his own affairs, she could not yet tell. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly. "I am not here to punish you, Edmund, though I could, and you know it. I could take these ledgers to your solicitor, to your aunt, to anyone whose opinion still matters to you. Instead, I am offering you a choice, and I expect an honest answer." Eleanor folded her hands on the desk, her posture perfectly composed, despite the storm of feeling beneath it. "End the arrangement with Camille Hargrove, not quietly, not with some private understanding that continues behind closed doors, but entirely, in a way that leaves no further drain on this estate's finances, or this family's name. Or continue as you are, and understand that I will begin taking whatever steps are necessary to protect Ashcombe from further damage, with or without your cooperation." Edmund was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, and weak afternoon light was pushing through the clouds, casting long shadows across the study floor. "You could have exposed this months ago. Why did you wait?" "Because I wanted to understand the full scope of it before I acted. And because, foolishly perhaps, I hoped you might come to your own conclusion, without needing to be forced into it." Eleanor's voice softened, just slightly, the first crack of real vulnerability she had allowed him to see since the wedding night. "I did not marry you expecting love, Edmund. But I did expect a partner in protecting what we were both given to steward. I have tried to be that partner these past 2 years, even when you gave me little reason to." Something shifted in Edmund's face then, a kind of reckoning that Eleanor had never seen cross his features before. He rose from the chair slowly, walked to the window, and stood looking out over the grounds, the same fields and cottages Eleanor had walked through countless times over the past 2 years, learning every family, every need, every quiet struggle the estate faced. "I will end it," he said finally, without turning around. "Properly. I owe you that much, if nothing else." Eleanor did not fully believe him, not yet, though something in his tone carried more weight than his usual careless promises. She watched him standing there at the window, a man caught between the comfortable habits of years and the sudden, uncomfortable weight of consequences finally catching up to him. And she felt no triumph in the moment, only a tired, cautious hope that perhaps, finally, something at Ashcombe Hall might begin to shift toward honesty. The following weeks brought small, uncertain changes. Edmund's visits to the village stopped entirely, or at least Eleanor heard no further word of them from the household staff, who had always been her most reliable source of quiet information. He began spending more time at the estate itself, riding out with Gerald Fenwick to inspect the tenant farms, sitting through long meetings about the coming harvest that he had previously left entirely to Eleanor's judgment. She allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that something real might be changing between them. They began taking meals together more regularly, conversations that started stiffly, but gradually grew easier, touching on the estate's affairs at first, and then, slowly, on smaller things. Books Eleanor had been reading, memories Edmund shared of his childhood at Ashcombe, before his father's health had begun its long decline. It was not love, not yet, and Eleanor was careful not to mistake it for something it was not. But it was, for the first time since her wedding day, something that felt honest, and after 2 years of careful, guarded distance, honesty alone felt like an enormous gift. The peace did not last as long as Eleanor had hoped. She learned, quite by accident, from a letter delivered to the estate, addressed to Edmund, that arrived while he was away inspecting the northern fields, that the arrangement with Camille had not ended as cleanly as he had claimed. The letter was brief, careful in its wording, but unmistakable in its meaning, a request for continued support, a reminder of promises made, a suggestion that whatever Edmund had told his wife, he had not told Camille the same thing. Eleanor sat with the letter in her hands for a long time that evening, feeling the fragile hope of the past weeks crack slowly apart beneath her fingers. She did not confront Edmund immediately when he returned. Instead, she folded the letter carefully, placed it in the same locked drawer where she kept her ledgers, and began, once again, to plan. She understood now, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that she could not build her entire future on the hope that Edmund would eventually choose honesty on his own. If real change was ever going to come to Ashcombe Hall, she would have to be the one to force it, just as she had forced every other improvement the estate had seen under her care. She began, quietly and carefully, to consider what independence might actually look like for a woman in her position. A duchess, bound by law and title, to a marriage that had never truly been a partnership. She did not yet have answers, but she had questions now, real ones, and for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a version of her future that did not depend entirely on whether her husband ever learned to be honest with her. Autumn arrived at Ashcombe, with its usual golden light and cooling air, and Eleanor continued her work exactly as she always had, visiting tenants, reviewing accounts, managing the household with the same quiet competence that had earned her the genuine respect of nearly everyone on the estate. But beneath the surface of her steady routine, something had changed. She was no longer simply protecting Ashcombe Hall for its own sake. She was, slowly and deliberately, beginning to protect herself as well, building the kind of quiet, careful strength that no one, not even a duke who had once assumed she would fade quietly into the background, could ever fully take away from her again. 3 years passed at Ashcombe Hall, and in that time, the estate transformed into something few in the county would have recognized from the struggling property Eleanor had first arrived at as a nervous young bride. The tenant farms flourished under careful management, their harvests among the strongest in the region. The household ran with quiet efficiency, and word of the remarkable Duchess who had turned Ashcombe's fortunes around had traveled well beyond the borders of their own county, reaching drawing rooms and dinner parties as far away as London itself. Edmund, for his part, had never fully broken away from Camille Hargrove, despite his promise on that rainy afternoon 3 years earlier. The affair continued in careful secrecy, conducted with more discretion than before, but Eleanor no longer needed secret letters to know the truth of it. She had made her peace, in her own quiet way, with the reality that her husband would never be the partner she had once hoped he might become. She poured her energy instead into the estate itself, and into a growing network of friendships and alliances that had nothing to do with him at all. It was during these years that Eleanor's quiet strength became something closer to genuine influence. Neighboring landowners sought her advice on managing their own tenant relationships. A young widow in the village, struggling to keep her late husband's small farm afloat, found in Eleanor not just financial help but real friendship, the kind Eleanor had rarely allowed herself since her arrival at Ashcombe. Gerald Fenwick, now fully trusted with the estate's daily operations, often remarked to Mrs. Colton that the Duchess understood the land and its people better than any master Ashcombe had seen in generations. Edmund noticed all of this, of course, though he said little about it directly. He had grown quieter over the years, his once easy charm dulled by the slow, grinding weight of maintaining two separate lives that increasingly refused to stay properly separated. His spending on Camille had not stopped, despite his earlier promise, and though Eleanor had tightened the estate's finances enough to limit the damage, she could see, in the careful way Edmund avoided certain conversations, that something beneath the surface of his life was beginning to strain. The crisis, when it finally arrived, came from a direction Eleanor had not fully anticipated. It began with a visit from Edmund's solicitor, a serious man, named Mr. Aldridge, who arrived unannounced on a gray autumn afternoon, requesting a private meeting with the Duke that stretched on for over 2 hours behind closed doors. Eleanor waited in her study, half suspecting the visit had something to do with the estate's finances, though she could not immediately guess how serious the matter might be. She learned the truth that evening, when Edmund finally emerged from the meeting looking pale and shaken, in a way Eleanor had never seen before. He came to find her in her study, closing the door carefully behind him, before speaking. "There is a debt," he said, his voice unsteady. "One I did not fully understand the scope of until today." Eleanor set down her pen slowly. "What kind of debt?" Edmund explained, haltingly, that his father had left behind certain financial obligations that had never been fully settled, loans taken against portions of the estate's future income that Edmund had not properly understood or managed in the years since his father's death. Combined with his own continued spending, both on Camille's household and on other private matters Eleanor was only beginning to learn about, the debt had grown into something that now threatened the estate's very stability. "How much?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the cold weight settling in her chest. The figure Edmund named was staggering, enough to threaten not just their comfort, but the estate's ability to support its tenants through the coming winter, enough to put Ashcombe Hall itself at risk if the debt was not addressed swiftly and carefully. Eleanor sat with the news for a long moment, feeling 3 years of careful, patient work suddenly hanging in the balance. She thought of every tenant family whose roofs she had personally arranged to repair, every child in the village she had come to know by name, every small, hard-won improvement she had built with her own 2 hands, while her husband quietly drained the estate's future to fund a life that had nothing to do with any of them. "We will need to act quickly," she said finally, her voice regaining its familiar steadiness. "I have ideas, Edmund, but I will need your full cooperation, and I will need honesty from you. Complete honesty, about every debt, every payment, every arrangement that touches this estate's finances. I cannot fix what I do not fully understand." Edmund nodded, looking, for the first time in their entire marriage, genuinely humbled in her presence. Over the following weeks, Eleanor worked tirelessly alongside Gerald Fenwick and Mr. Aldridge to untangle the full scope of the estate's financial troubles, discovering layer after layer of poor decisions stretching back years, some from Edmund's father, many more from Edmund himself. She proposed a careful plan, drawing on reserves she had quietly built up over her years of careful management, negotiating extended terms with the estate's creditors, and cutting unnecessary expenses wherever she could find them, without harming the tenants who depended on Ashcombe for their livelihoods. It was grueling work, long nights spent poring over figures by candlelight, difficult conversations with creditors who had little patience for a duchess managing what they assumed should be her husband's responsibility. Through it all, Edmund watched Eleanor work with a growing, uncomfortable awareness of exactly how much he had taken for granted over the years of their marriage. He began attending the difficult creditor meetings alongside her, learning, slowly and belatedly, the details of an estate he had spent years assuming would simply continue running itself. "I do not know how to thank you for this," he said one evening, finding her still working by candlelight long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. "You did not have to fight this hard to save something I nearly destroyed." Eleanor looked up from her ledgers, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I did not do this for you, Edmund. I did it for every family whose home depends on this estate surviving. I did it because I have spent 3 years building something real here, and I refuse to watch it crumble because of debts I did not create." It was, Eleanor realized, even as she spoke the words, the most honest thing she had said to her husband in a very long time, and perhaps, she thought later, the moment when the last of her old hope for their marriage finally, quietly died. She had saved Ashcombe Hall, but she understood now, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, despite the exhaustion weighing on her, that she had saved it for herself, and for the people who depended on it, not for a husband who had never truly earned the effort. The estate's finances slowly stabilized over the following months, though the damage to Edmund's reputation among his peers proved harder to repair than any ledger. Word of the near collapse had spread quietly through certain circles, and though Eleanor's careful management had prevented outright disaster, whispers followed Edmund at gatherings he had once attended with easy confidence. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Ashcombe understood what it meant to be seen as unreliable, as a man whose judgment could no longer be fully trusted, and the weight of that new reputation settled heavily on him, in ways Eleanor watched from a careful, guarded distance. Camille Hargrove's true nature revealed itself fully in the spring, following the estate's financial crisis, though Eleanor learned the details only secondhand, through Mrs. Colton, who had her own quiet network of connections throughout the county. It seemed that once word spread of Edmund's damaged finances and his diminished standing among his peers, Camille's affection for him cooled with remarkable speed. She had, according to the whispers that eventually reached Ashcombe Hall, already begun courting the attention of a wealthy merchant recently arrived in the county, a man whose fortune remained considerably more stable than a duke whose estate had nearly collapsed under years of careless spending. Edmund learned the truth in the cruelest possible way, arriving unannounced at Camille's cottage one afternoon to find the merchant's carriage already waiting outside, and Camille herself, dressed for an outing that clearly had nothing to do with him. Eleanor did not witness the confrontation that followed, but she saw its aftermath clearly enough when Edmund returned to Ashcombe Hall that evening, pale and shaken in a way she had never seen from him before, not even during the worst of the financial crisis months earlier. He did not speak of it directly for several days, retreating instead into a kind of quiet, brooding silence that filled the halls of Ashcombe with a heaviness Eleanor found herself, despite everything, almost sympathizing with. She had spent years watching this man chase a love that had never been as solid as he believed it to be, and though she felt no triumph in watching it finally collapse, she also felt, for the first time since her wedding day, a strange and unexpected sense of clarity about her own future. She found Edmund one evening in the library, staring into the same unlit fireplace where he had once told her, on their wedding night, that his heart belonged to someone else. The irony of the scene was not lost on Eleanor, as she stood quietly in the doorway, watching him for a long moment before finally speaking. "She left you for a merchant's fortune," Eleanor said, not unkindly, though there was no softness in her voice either. Edmund did not turn around. "I suppose I deserve to hear that said plainly. I am not here to gloat, Edmund. I am here because I think it is time we spoke honestly about what happens next, for both of us." He finally turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw, in the tired lines of his face, a man who had lost the one thing he had spent years believing mattered more than anything else, only to discover it had never truly been real in the way he imagined. "What do you propose?" Eleanor had spent weeks preparing for this exact conversation, though she had not known precisely when it would arrive. I have given 5 years of my life to saving this estate, Edmund. I have built real relationships with the tenants, real trust among the staff, real stability in accounts that would have collapsed entirely without my efforts. I have done this work honestly, and I have done it despite a marriage that gave me very little in return. You want to leave, Edmund said quietly, understanding settling over his features. I want independence, Eleanor corrected. I have already spoken privately with Mr. Aldridge about arrangements that would allow me to maintain a household of my own, using resources I have personally earned through the improvements I brought to this estate. I do not intend to abandon Ashcombe entirely, not while its people still depend on stability I helped build. But I will no longer live as a wife waiting quietly for a husband who has never once chosen me over anyone or anything else. The arrangement Eleanor proposed was, by the standards of their society, unusual, though not entirely unprecedented among couples whose marriages had grown distant enough to require careful, practical solutions. She would relocate to a smaller property several miles from Ashcombe Hall, a modest but comfortable house that Mr. Aldridge had helped her secure, using funds tied directly to the financial recovery she herself had engineered. She would remain legally married to Edmund, maintaining the title and the protections it afforded her, but she would live independently, continuing to oversee certain aspects of the estate's tenant relationships from a respectful distance, while building, for the first time in her adult life, a household that answered to no one but herself. Edmund did not argue against the plan, though Eleanor could see the toll it took on him to accept it. Whatever remained of his pride had already been thoroughly tested by Camille's departure, and he seemed to understand, with a clarity that had taken him far too long to reach, that he had no real grounds left to ask Eleanor to stay, simply for the sake of appearances. "You have given this estate more than I ever deserved from you," he said finally, his voice quiet in the dim library light. "I will not stand in the way of whatever life you choose to build now." Eleanor left Ashcombe Hall 3 weeks later, on a clear morning in early summer, the same season in which she had first arrived as a nervous young bride 5 years earlier. The tenants she had come to know so well gathered along the drive to see her off, many of them openly emotional, thanking her for improvements that had changed the course of their lives, for roofs repaired and wages fairly paid, and a kindness they had never expected from anyone bearing the Ashcombe name. Mrs. Colton embraced her tightly at the carriage door, and Gerald Fenwick promised, with evident sincerity, that he would continue managing the estate exactly as she had taught him, honestly and with the tenants' true interests always at heart. The house Eleanor moved into, a modest stone property called Fairview, surrounded by gardens she immediately began planning to restore, felt strange to her at first, quiet in a way Ashcombe Hall's constant activity had never allowed. But within weeks, that quiet transformed into something Eleanor had not experienced in years, a kind of peace that belonged entirely to her, undisturbed by the careful management of a marriage that had never truly been a partnership. She threw herself into building a new life, with the same determined energy she had once poured into saving Ashcombe's finances. She began advising several smaller estates in the surrounding county, women whose husbands had proven similarly careless with their family fortunes, sharing the hard-won knowledge she had gathered over years of managing tenant relationships and untangling complicated accounts. Word of her expertise spread quietly but steadily, and within a year, Eleanor found herself running a small but genuinely respected consulting practice among the landed families of the region, a role no woman of her station had ever quite occupied before. She made new friends during this period, women who admired her independence, rather than pitying her unconventional circumstances. Among them was a widow named Charlotte Pemberton, whose sharp wit and genuine warmth quickly became one of the great comforts of Eleanor's new life. The two women spent long afternoons together, discussing everything from estate management to books, to the strange, freeing experience of building a life that answered to no husband's expectations. There was, too, a growing friendship with a local physician named Henry Whitmore, a thoughtful and unassuming man who had first come to Fairview to treat one of Eleanor's household staff and had gradually become a regular presence in her life, discussing everything from medicine to philosophy, over long, comfortable conversations that Eleanor found herself looking forward to more than she cared to fully admit, even to Charlotte. She did not rush toward anything resembling romance, mindful of the legal complexities of her continued marriage to Edmund, but she allowed herself, For the first time since her wedding day, the simple pleasure of a friendship, built on genuine mutual respect and easy conversation, without the weight of obligation or comparison to someone else's affection. News from Ashcombe Hall reached her periodically, carried by Mrs. Colton's occasional letters or by Gerald Fenwick's careful updates on the estate's continued stability. Edmund, it seemed, had retreated largely from society following Camille's departure, spending his days managing the estate with a diligence Eleanor found almost sadly ironic, given how many years he had ignored those same responsibilities while she quietly carried them alone. He did not remarry, nor did he pursue any other romantic attachment that reached Eleanor's ears, and though she felt no particular satisfaction in his apparent loneliness, she also felt no obligation to soften it. 2 years passed this way, Eleanor building her independent life at Fairview with steady, quiet confidence, her reputation growing among the county's landowners, her friendships deepening, her sense of self settling into something she had never quite possessed during her years at Ashcombe Hall. She had become, in every way that mattered, exactly the kind of woman her mother had once described to her on the eve of her wedding, clever and sharp enough to build a good life inside even the most difficult circumstances, patient enough to wait for her own strength to fully reveal itself. She did not think often of Edmund during those years, and when she did, it was with a distant, settled kind of peace rather than any lingering bitterness. Whatever pain their marriage had caused her, Eleanor had transformed it, piece by careful piece, into something that belonged entirely to her own making, a life built on her own terms, answering to no one's expectations but her own. She had no way of knowing, as she settled comfortably into the rhythms of her new life at Fairview, that Edmund's quiet retreat from society was about to end, or that the man who had once looked past her at their wedding altar was, even then, beginning to understand exactly what he had thrown away. 4 years after Eleanor left Ashcombe Hall, a carriage she did not recognize arrived at Fairview on a cold afternoon in late autumn, the kind of gray, quiet day that made the whole world feel muted and still. Eleanor was in her garden, wrapped in a warm shawl, discussing the winter planting with her housekeeper, when she heard the sound of wheels on gravel, and looked up to see a familiar crest painted on the carriage door, faded now, but unmistakable. She had not expected to feel her heart quicken the way it did, watching Edmund step down from the carriage after 4 years of near-total silence between them. He looked older than she remembered, the confident ease that had once defined him, replaced by something quieter, more careful, the posture of a man who had spent years learning humility the hard way. "Eleanor," he said, standing at the edge of her garden with his hat in his hands, an oddly formal gesture from a man who had once assumed the world would simply arrange itself around his comfort. "Edmund." She kept her voice even, though she was aware of her housekeeper watching the exchange with poorly disguised curiosity. "This is unexpected. I wrote several times. I did not know if the letters reached you, or if you simply chose not to answer them." Eleanor had, in fact, received 2 letters from Edmund over the past year, both of which she had read carefully, and then set aside without response, unsure of what honest reply she could possibly offer a husband whose presence in her life had become, over 4 years of careful independence, something closer to a distant memory than a living concern. "I received them. I was not certain what you hoped I might say in return." "May we speak privately?" Edmund asked, glancing briefly toward the housekeeper, who took the hint and retreated toward the house with a final curious glance over her shoulder. Eleanor led him to a small stone bench near the edge of her garden, the same spot where she often sat in the evenings reading letters from Charlotte or reviewing notes from her consulting work with the county's estates. She did not invite him inside, a small but deliberate choice that Edmund seemed to understand without needing it explained. "You look well," he said, once they were seated, an awkward opening that Eleanor let pass without comment. "Fairview suits you. I have heard, from various sources, that you have built quite a reputation for yourself among the county's landowners. I have kept myself occupied," Eleanor said simply. "What brings you here, Edmund? I doubt you traveled this distance simply to comment on my garden." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness Eleanor had never heard from him before, not even during the darkest days of the estate's financial crisis. "I have spent 4 years alone at Ashcombe, Eleanor. 4 years with nothing but time to understand exactly how much I took for granted, and exactly how much I lost through my own carelessness. Camille is married now, to that merchant she left me for. I hear they are quite happy, or at least quite wealthy, which I have come to understand is not always the same thing. I am sorry to hear it did not end well for you, Eleanor said, and she was somewhat surprised to find that she meant it, not out of any lingering affection, but out of the simple, weary compassion one might feel for any person who had wasted years chasing something that had never truly been real. I did not come here for sympathy. Edmund set his hat aside and finally looked at her directly, the careful formality of his earlier words giving way to something more vulnerable. I came here because I have finally understood, far too late, exactly what I had in you, and exactly what I threw away, chasing something that was never worth the cost. You saved Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor. You saved it twice over, first from my father's neglect and then from my own foolishness, and I repaid that loyalty with years of carelessness and public humiliation that you never once deserved. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest, an old, familiar ache she had thought long buried beneath 4 years of careful, independent peace. Why are you telling me this now, Edmund? What is it you actually want? He hesitated, and for a moment, Eleanor saw the same uncertain young duke who had stood beside her at their wedding altar, unable to fully meet her eyes. I am asking you to come home. Not out of obligation, and not because the law still binds us together, but because I have finally learned to see you clearly, Eleanor, as the remarkable woman you have always been, and I cannot bear the thought of spending the rest of my life having thrown that away, without at least asking if there is any part of you willing to give me a chance to earn it back. The garden was quiet around them, the last of the autumn leaves drifting slowly from the trees overhead, and Eleanor sat with Edmund's words for a long moment, feeling the full weight of everything they represented. 5 years of marriage built on cold indifference, humiliation endured in silence, a slow and painful climb toward independence that had cost her more than Edmund could ever fully understand. Do you have any idea, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, what it felt like to stand at that altar and watch you look past me, toward a door you hoped someone else might walk through? Do you understand what it cost me to build a life at Ashcombe, while you spent years choosing another woman over the wife standing right in front of you? I understand it better now than I ever did, Edmund said quietly. I understand it every single day I have spent alone at Ashcombe since Camille left, finally seeing clearly exactly what kind of husband I was, and exactly what kind of wife I was fortunate enough to have, even if I was too blind to recognize it until it was far too late. Eleanor looked out over her garden, the careful, peaceful life she had built entirely on her own terms over the past 4 years, the friendships with Charlotte and Henry, the respected reputation she had earned through her own hard work, the quiet contentment of a household that answered to no one's expectations but her own. She thought of the frightened young bride who had once stood at an altar, powerless and unwanted, and the woman who now sat before Edmund, steady and whole, having built something real out of the wreckage he had left behind.
I forgive you, Edmund,
she said finally, and she watched something like relief flicker across his face before she continued, her voice gentle but entirely firm. I forgive you, because carrying anger for the rest of my life would only cost me more than it cost you, and I have spent too many years already paying prices that were never mine to pay. But forgiveness is not the same as returning to a life I fought this hard to leave behind. Eleanor, I built Fairview with my own hands. Edmund, in every sense that matters. I built a reputation, a household, a circle of friends who value me exactly as I am, without needing me to compete for their attention, or earn my place through quiet suffering. I am not the same woman who stood at your altar 5 years ago, hoping desperately that affection might grow from cold obligation. I do not need you to complete the life I have built. I built it precisely because you never could. Edmund sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the quiet, unshakable strength in her words, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a kind of weary acceptance rather than further argument. Then I hope, at the very least, that you have found real happiness here. You deserve it, Eleanor, more than I have ever properly told you. I have, Eleanor said simply, and she found, saying the words aloud, that they were entirely true. I have found a life that belongs completely to me, built on my own strength, rather than anyone else's affection. That is worth more than any title I might have carried at your side." Edmund left Fairview that evening, as the last light faded from the autumn sky, carrying with him a quiet, humbled understanding of everything he had lost through years of careless choices. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the long drive, and she felt, standing alone in her garden in the gathering dusk, not triumph exactly, but something steadier and more lasting, a deep, settled peace, in knowing that whatever came next in her life, she would meet it exactly as she had learned to meet everything else since that cold wedding day 5 years earlier, on her own terms, answering to no one but herself. Word of Edmund's visit to Fairview traveled quickly through the county, as such things always did, and Eleanor found herself, in the weeks that followed, fielding curious questions from acquaintances, eager to know whether the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe might finally reconcile after years of quiet separation. Eleanor answered these questions with the same calm honesty she had come to rely on throughout her years of independence, explaining simply that she wished Edmund well, and that her own life at Fairview remained exactly as full and settled as it had been before his visit. Charlotte Pemberton, arriving for their usual afternoon visit not long after, listened to the full account of Edmund's appearance with her characteristic sharp attention, and when Eleanor finished, she reached over and squeezed her friend's hand warmly. "You have grown into someone remarkable, Eleanor. I do not think the woman who first arrived here 4 years ago would have been able to send him away so steadily, without a single moment of doubt." "I had doubts," Eleanor admitted, smiling faintly. "I simply chose not to let them decide anything for me." That distinction, Eleanor had come to understand over her years at Fairview, was the truest measure of the strength she had built for herself. Doubt and old feeling could visit without being given the final word. She had learned to sit with difficult emotions, to acknowledge them honestly, and then to choose, deliberately and with clear eyes, the path that best served the life she actually wanted to live, rather than the life old habit or lingering hope might otherwise pull her toward. Her friendship with Henry Whitmore deepened steadily over the following year, unhurried and comfortable, in a way that felt entirely different from the anxious uncertainty of her first marriage. Henry never pressed her for more than she was ready to give, content instead to build something slowly, conversation by conversation, shared afternoon by shared afternoon, until Eleanor found herself, almost without noticing the exact moment it happened, genuinely looking forward to his visits, in a way that went beyond simple friendship. She did not rush toward any formal understanding with him, mindful still of her complicated legal ties to Edmund, but she allowed herself, for the first time in her adult life, the quiet pleasure of a connection built entirely on mutual respect, shared laughter, and the simple comfort of being fully known and fully valued, exactly as she was, without needing to compete for anyone's attention or prove her worth through quiet sacrifice. Her consulting work continued to grow as well, expanding beyond the immediate county as word of her expertise reached further afield. She began corresponding with several other women in similar circumstances, wives and widows managing estates their husbands had neglected or mismanaged, offering practical guidance drawn from her own hard-won experience. She found deep satisfaction in this work, not simply for the income it provided, though that mattered too, but for the quiet knowledge that her own difficult years at Ashcombe had ultimately given her the tools to help other women navigate similarly difficult circumstances with more confidence than she herself had once possessed. Gerald Fenwick continued managing Ashcombe Hall with the same honest diligence Eleanor had instilled in him years earlier, and occasional reports reached her confirming that the estate remained stable, its tenants well cared for, its finances carefully balanced. Edmund, she learned through these same quiet channels, had settled into a much quieter life than he had once led, spending his days managing the estate's affairs with a steadiness that would have seemed impossible to imagine during the careless years of their early marriage. He did not seek her out again after that autumn afternoon at Fairview, seeming to understand, finally and completely, that her answer had been genuine, rather than simply a temporary refusal born of old hurt. 5 years after her departure from Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor stood once more in her garden at Fairview, now fully mature and flourishing under years of careful attention, watching the last golden light of an autumn afternoon settle over the grounds she had built entirely through her own patient effort. Henry sat beside her on the same stone bench where Edmund had once made his final plea, though the memory carried none of its old weight now, softened by years of distance and the settled peace of a life fully her own. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like these, of the frightened young bride who had once stood at an altar, watching a man look past her, toward a door that never opened, believing in that moment that her worth depended entirely on winning an affection that had never truly been available to her. She thought of how far she had traveled since that cold wedding day, through humiliation and quiet endurance, through the slow, careful work of building something real out of neglect, through the difficult choice to walk away from a marriage that could never have given her what she actually deserved. She had built, in the end, exactly the life her mother had once promised was possible, even inside the most difficult circumstances, a life defined not by the affection of a husband who never chose her, but by her own patient strength, her own hard-won expertise, her own carefully cultivated circle of friendship and respect. She had needed no one's permission to become the woman she was now, steady and whole, sitting in a garden she had built with her own hands, surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was. Edmund had knocked at her door once, hoping to reclaim what he had so carelessly thrown away, and Eleanor had answered honestly, without anger and without regret, closing that chapter of her life with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every difficult moment since her wedding day. Whatever came next for her, she understood now, with complete certainty, would be built entirely on her own terms, a life fully earned and fully hers, answering to no one's expectations but her own.